So I'm going to roll through some parts of this kind of fast tonight because this is a talk that's intended for a little bit longer. So I'm happy to answer questions. You'll see I go through some of the cases that I have here pretty quickly, but you're welcome to write down any questions you have and we'll hit them at the end. The purpose of this is just to reintroduce you guys to California Wildlife Center, what we do, what kinds of patients we take, and to give you an example of some of the cases that we've done over the years to help you understand kind of what the process is when an animal comes to our facility. So here to start off with, we've got a really cute little baby skunk. So you will see this guy again a little later in the presentation. I just like him for the start because I find skunks to be a really misunderstood and really freaking cute baby animal. So I always like to start off with that guy. So we have been around since 1998. We provide full service veterinary care that is free for rescuers. So we often get the question on the phone, or we get people who are concerned about bringing animals in because of cost. We do not charge anyone for our services. Depending on the time of year, we have about 13 to 16 employees and about 200 active volunteers. And those folks are really critical to the work that we do because we cover an area that encompasses about 10 million people, give or take about 4 million, depending on what you look at. And from that area, we take over 35,000 calls. And those calls are usually the start of an intake, not the end. So when we say we take 35,000 calls, from those calls, we usually ask folks to text us an image so we can assess the animal and work with them to decide what kind of help that animal needs. And so it's really just the beginning of what we do. And through those calls, those texts, and our relationships with vet clinics and the shelters, I put about 4,000 animals a year. It usually ranges up to, from 3,900 up to about 4,500. We are a generalist facility, so to speak, so we don't specialize in any one species. We take nearly all native California wildlife. The ones that are accepted from that are things like mountain lions, bears, and raccoons that require really, really, really specialized housing or specialized care. It always makes me laugh to include raccoons along with mountain lions and bears, but it is true they are just that difficult to care for properly. But we are the only facility in LA County that is permitted for mule deer fawns, coyotes, and bobcats. We are the only dawn to dusk songbird nursery in LA County. That's really critical for baby songbird care, that you actually feed them from sun up to sundown. If you feed them for shorter periods of time, they will really suffer and not grow properly. So it's really special that we are able to open and close that with each season. And we're the only facility in California serving both marine mammals and other kind of what we would consider terrestrial wildlife. There may be other ones in the country, but we're the only one I know of kind of locally. Our patients come from up to 4 hours away. So we get patients from as far as San Diego and all the way up through Santa Barbara. We sometimes get transfers from further away. But about 30% of our patients in 2023 came from the proper city of Los Angeles. And most of our other patients came from surrounding cities in LA County. Since this is a poison-free Agora meeting, you guys can see Agora's on there. We got 5.4% of our animals from Agora. And that number just comes from what's labeled in our system. So if we don't know the origin of an animal, or if an animal maybe went into a shelter where that origin wasn't written down, then they often just get lumped into the city of LA. We have 3 departments. So that's going to be marine mammal, our ICU, and our NICU. Our marine mammal department is our department that takes, all of our pinnipeds, so our seals and sea lions, any seabirds off of the beaches, they will transport. And this is our only department that does a really extensive amount of actual rescue. Because of the sheer distance that our facility covers, we unfortunately just aren't able to go do most rescue and pickup. We actually rely on members of the public and regional animal control departments to do that part of it and bring animals to us. But because we can't really ask somebody to put an elephant seal in their back seat, we do have some capability through our marine mammal department to do rescue off the beaches in Malibu. We have a very strict jurisdiction that we pick up from in that area, and we will pick up from the beaches in that area. Not because we only care about Malibu, but just because that's the only area where we can really consistently set a boundary on what we're doing. Um, so our marine mammal department does rescue, transport, and on-site rehab of some animals, but we are limited on space, and so some of our animals from the marine mammal department do get transferred to other facilities. Most of what we get is going to be the northern elephant seal, so that's who you're seeing in that photo is a northern elephant seal pup, or the California sea lion are our most common patients. But we will see things like the Guadalupe fur seal, the harbor seal, or even things like the northern fur seal less commonly. Our ICU is the heart of what we would call our terrestrial or our wildlife hospital. And this is the area where you're going to see really high intensity care. So there's pretty high level medicine that happens in this department, but it's on mostly adult animals or animals who are otherwise really highly stressed by human presence. So that's going to be things like adult birds of prey or raptors, songbirds, small mammals like, squirrels, we call them mesopredators like coyotes and bobcats, and then our mule deer fawns. These are animals who often have really complicated care needs like bandage changes, splints, surgeries, really specialized medicine that they need care for, but who are poorly served by being too close to people. So everything that's in the ICU, we're going to be trying to spend as little physical time around them as possible, because every time they're exposed to us, they consider us a predator. And so you might even think of every time they see us as like a near-death experience. So we are going to do everything with them as quickly, as quietly, as carefully as we can. So we may only see these patients a couple of times a day at most. Conversely, then we have our NICU, our neonatal ICU, and this area is going to be kind of neonate through juvenile animals who require high frequency care. In particular, that's going to be prey animals. So things like little baby songbirds, young squirrels, young opossums, these things that if we kept them in the same space that we keep our coyotes, our bobcats, and our raptors, they would be living in fear. But conversely, they may not be as stressed by human presence because we're feeding them. And so in this space, the animals are receiving care maybe even as frequently as every 30 minutes. That care is going to be the same kind of care over and over and over. And it's really critical that it's done exactly the same way every single time. But so it is an area that's more where animals are exposed to us a little bit more, but where the care is very direct, very quick, and then we move on. And in those places, we provide a really wide range of kinds of care. And that's going to be typically what we would call veterinary care, husbandry care, and then care of animals who don't actually come into our facility through our wildlife hotline. Veterinary care is going to be things that are exemplified by this bobcat who's in this image. You'll see her again later, but here she is actually intubated and anesthetized for surgery. That's some of that really high level medical care that we can do because we have a full veterinary staff, a staff veterinarian. We can do things like examination, we can prescribe medications, we can do regular wound care and even really complex wound care. I've written it as pathology. Most commonly for us, you're going to see our pathology take the form of us doing fecal exams so that we can treat our animals for internal or external parasites. And we can do really complex surgeries, x-rays, all those things that you would see in a normal vet clinic. If it's appropriate for us to do them to our wild patient, we can do them. And backing that up is really the foundation of everything that we do, which is really complex husbandry. And that's going to include things like watching their nutrition. So a lot of our animals aren't going to want to eat when they get to us. They're afraid, and eating makes them vulnerable. But it also is how they heal. So we need them to eat. We need to provide them the right nutrition. And we can do things like offer them food that we would consider to be really high value for that species. Or if we absolutely have to, we can do things like tube them, force feed them, whatever we need to do to get them over that initial hump, get them eating on their own so that they can support their own bodies in the healing process. We also offer them different kinds of enrichment. Enrichment is often in animal care fields kind of seen as the fun toy that animal gets. But for us, it's really critical. I always like to give the example of providing leafy branching for our songbirds. For some folks, that's considered kind of an optional extra. We consider that to be critical to that animal's care because, for a little tiny songbird, for instance, if they're bouncing around an enclosure terrified of me, and I put in a branch with 3 leaves on it, I love songbirds very much, and they are perhaps not bright in the way we know to be bright. And so they will stand next to that leaf and say, I am invisible. Nobody can see me, and I am safe now because I am standing next to this leaf. And that reduces their stress. And that's really critical for the veterinary care that we provide because stress has been shown in all kinds of research to actually reduce your ability to heal, reduce your ability to fight infection. And so reducing that stress is the most fundamental part of what we do. And by knowing each species really intimately, we can figure out what we can provide for them to help reduce stress. And the last part of husbandry would be conditioning for release. We have enclosures that are suited to all kinds of different animals in all different stages of healing. And we want those animals, when we release them, to be at their best. Just like when you leave the hospital, you are not at your best. You are weak. You've been laying in bed. You've been having people poking and prodding at you all night. You're exhausted. Animals that are coming out of our care initially feel the same way, and we don't want to release them in that state. We want them to be out there being the best predator or the best prey that they can be to either catch their prey or escape from their predator as effectively as they could before they came to us. And so by putting them outdoors in enclosures where we maybe only enter the enclosure once a day just to make sure they're fed, watered, and cleaned, and giving them enough space to exercise, move from branch to branch, and in some cases encouraging them to do that exercise, we can make sure that they're going out with really strong muscles, with all the rest that they need, and really acclimated to that outdoor weather, those outdoor weather conditions. I think my favorite patients, as much as I love all of our patients, are the animals who never have to come in. So I like to highlight our wildlife hotline because really what we've done a really good job of over the last 10 or 20 years is honing what we know about the animals who do and don't actually need to come into our facility. There are things like fledgling birds who just need time and a safe place on the ground so they can learn how to fly. Things like a really common call for us is egrets walking in the freeway median because they like to hunt gophers there. And so people will call and say, oh my God, this bird is just walking. There's no water anywhere. I'm really worried about him. And we get to create a safer environment, both for that person on the freeway who's considering pulling over in a dangerous place to try and help that animal, and that bird who just needs to be left alone. And actually, by being chased, they could potentially be driven into traffic or something similar. We can assess these situations, walk people through them, and help them ensure that what they're doing is in that animal's best interest because different things can change that animal's behavior. And unless you're receiving those calls and looking at those animals all the time, there's no way you would know that a great egret likes to go only in February and March and hunt in the freeway median for whatever reason he likes to do that. So that wildlife hotline covers things like what conflict calls. So conflict calls would be things like there's a coyote repeatedly coming to my backyard, behavior assessments, like the assessment of that, egret in the median, and pre-admission intervention, where we are actually preventing people from touching or interfering with wildlife that doesn't need help. We do other things beyond our clinic. So we do a lot to work with public health. I'm mostly going to skip through that, but we do work with them really closely to actually help with human and agricultural health in addition to wildlife. And we donate information, and if our patients don't make it, we give the specimens or carcasses to different research institutions to try and better understand our patients and the struggles that they face. And we offer a lot of insight and resolution into these conflict situations where we can be empathetic, non-judgmental, and really here for both the people and the animals involved when people do find themselves struggling to understand their wild neighbors. So I wanted to take you guys quickly through some of the common reasons animals end up in our care, and we'll briefly look at a few cases. We're going to go through this a little faster. So if you guys feel like I skip over a case that you want to know more about, definitely flag it in the chat and I can go over it with you guys at the end. I would say probably the most common is going to be blunt force trauma. So that's going to be things like automobile collisions, window strikes, construction, all of these things where we have either put something in the way of that animal, or that animal is running into something they can't see due to speed, or due to the material. So this is a really good example. This is that same bobcat from earlier. She and her mother were actually hit by a car just outside of Satwewa or Rancho Sierra Vista in Newberry Park. Unfortunately, her mother did not survive, but she did. But she had a broken hip, and the head of her femur was basically sheared off and was floating around in her body. So this was her before she got covered in her drape. The difficult thing about surgery is that you cover the animal in all these drapes, and so they just look like a big pile of blue towels. So this was that animal on monitoring before she actually had surgery to remove that kind of floating femoral head. We copied basically a surgery that happens in small animals, in dogs and cats, called a femoral head osteectomy. And we relied on the ability of her body's connective tissues to strengthen and hold that area together. So we didn't actually bone it back together. We pulled a piece of it out and we let her body do what we knew it would do based off of a similar surgery that's done in dogs and cats. And so you'll find that there are cases where we do a similar surgery to dogs and cats and cases where we can't do it. It just depends on the patient, depends on the circumstances. And in this case, it worked out really well. She recovered really well. Over time, we had her in an outdoor enclosure where she relearned how to run, jump, and climb. Because she didn't have the ability to stay with her mom, we did actually keep her until the following spring. So we received her in late summer or early fall, and we released her in the following spring so that she had had time in our care to practice hunting and grow a little bit larger. And this was her release. Back to Satwewa, we were actually able to work with the Park Service to get her back to what was probably her mom's home territory. So I linger on this one a little bit because one of the frequent questions we get is, do your patients seem grateful, or do they say goodbye? And there is a moment here where you can see that this animal is actually looking back. And what I feel like is important to point out is that what she's doing is looking for the trick. She's been in our care for months at this point, and every time that she thought she could get away, there was a person to catch her again. And here, as soon as she realizes that's no longer the case, she is actually free to go and do what she wants, she books it. And I think it's wonderful. I think it's great that we released that animal wanting nothing to do with people ever again. That really is our goal, is not for our patients to know and feel grateful to us, but to move on and be wild and independent. A really common secondary issue for our animals is predation, or another issue, not secondary, this is usually their primary problem. Then that's going to be animals who've been caught by something else. In some cases, that's going to be natural predators like a hawk, but more commonly, it's going to be domestic animals. Cat caught and dog caught animals are a really significant portion of our intakes. And it's really important that we see those animals who've been touched by a dog or cat, even if it's not obvious that they have wounds. So this is a white crowned sparrow. This video should start here. And he is drinking some medications. I really love working with white crowned sparrows because they will drink like anything sweet, and it makes caring for them a lot easier. So he's drinking some pain medication and some antibiotics here. Those antibiotics are really important because the way cat and teeth operate is they're so thin and fine that they can go into the animal's body and then out of the animal's body, dragging in anything from the surface of the skin, feathers, fur, saliva from the cat's mouth. And then, especially in the case of birds, that skin can seal back over with minimal bleeding. So even if you don't see an injury, there could potentially be actually a source of really serious bacterial infection, which can cause sepsis. That sepsis can cause death within about 48 hours. So any animal who is touched by a dog or cat, whether or not you can recognize an injury, needs to come into a rehabilitator for evaluation and antibiotics to prevent that problem. Additionally, sometimes there's issues that aren't easy for the average person to see. So this is a little fledgling mockingbird from a few years ago. I'm really proud of this because this was a very hard splint to put on his little tiny leg there. I don't know if you guys can see, but he actually had a broken leg there. And it wasn't that easy to tell. The person could only tell that he wasn't standing on it. She couldn't tell that it was an actual broken bone. And if we hadn't had the ability to promptly get this bird into care and get that splinted, these little birds heal really quickly and that bone will start to set within a couple of days. So keeping that animal at home and waiting to see if they do well is not a good option. They need to come into care, get a splint if they need it, antibiotics, pain medication, because their little bodies move really quickly into that next stage of healing, and we want to set them up for success. This was an interesting case because this little opossum had two issues. She was actually hit by a car and dog caught. So the hit by car was the reason she directly came into us, but she had old injuries as well. And in this photo, our veterinarian was really doing that comprehensive care that we're really lucky to be able to do. So he was actually checking in her sinuses. She'd had some skull fractures. They had really caused some issues in her sinus pathways. And he was checking to see if he could still hear a bunch of congestion up in those pathways. Nest and den disturbance is common for us as well. So that's going to be from things like tree trimming, wind events or storms, construction, and rarely abandonment. It does happen, but it's less common than human interference. That's going to be things like this little skunk. It's the same guy from earlier. These guys are often affected by dogs actually interfering with the parent. Um, Fawns, we have a big problem with people's best intentions interfering with them. Fawns are often left alone. Their mothers, when they're really young, will tuck them into a bush because they're too young to keep up with them. And so they tuck them into a bush. The baby has no scent at that point and will just have the instinct to curl up and wait for mom. And sometimes people actually don't realize that that's what baby's doing. And so when baby is quiet and tucked down in the bushes and they find them, they assume that that means the baby's not doing well. And it's actually not uncommon for them to either bring them into their home and try and wait for mom and keep the baby in their home in the meantime, thereby keeping them away from mom, or a really unfortunate one is in LA, people have a tendency to tuck these animals into their backpack after finding them on the trail and then hike them out and take them to a ranger station. The problem being that it's really difficult to reunite deer with their parents in the best of cases, let alone if you've hiked them out and you don't really remember exactly where you found them. So we have this really unfortunate problem with these sort of kidnapped fawns. In this case, both of these animals clearly needed to come in. The fawn on the right has a curled ear from dehydration. The fawn on the left actually had little knuckling legs, so that's why she's got little wraps on her front feet. We were able to wrap them, straighten out her legs, and she actually did really well long term. And then this is a common one, especially we're coming to the end of owl season, but we're not quite out of it. These are little baby barn owls. These guys really commonly get knocked out of nests early in the season if there's a rain event or something similar. We also get entanglement and contamination. So these are basically things that people leave out, that if we didn't leave them out, animals wouldn't get stuck in them. So that's going to be things like fishing hook and line, string and garbage, oil, either crude oil or actually things like motor oil or unsecured cooking oil in the waste area of restaurants, or glue traps. We got this call about a Canada goose that was limping, and this is what that back left leg looks like. I won't put you guys through too much of it, but there's a lot of gory photos that I have of this case because unfortunately, usually these get worse before they get better. You have to dig in there to remove that constricted thread and actually take out the dead skin. And over time, usually once you do that, more skin is going to die and slough. And in order to make it the best possible healing process, you need to have them on antibiotics and continue to go in and clean that, sometimes surgically. And so we don't recommend, often people will just cut these animals loose and let them go. Unless it's a really fresh entanglement, that animal needs to come in. We need to check that there's nothing dug in, that the skin's not going to die. But that said, they can be really, really rewarding cases. This was immediately after removing all of that and taking out some of the dead skin. This was like day one. Geese love to eat. As soon as they feel better, they will eat. And immediately, this guy was standing on that foot and eating. So you can see how quickly we can make a difference for them. I know this one is a big deal for you guys. It's a big deal for us too, toxicity. And that's going to include things like secondary poisoning from rodenticide, things like domoic acid. Domoic acid also works through the same, what we would call bioaccumulation that secondary poisoning does, where the prey is filled with a toxin that makes its way up the food chain. In the case of domoic acid, it's actually a algae. It's the most common one is Pseudonychia. It produces this neurotoxin, domoic acid, that is then, it works its way up the food chain into things like dolphins and sea lions. We had a really significant domoic acid year last year that was tough for our marine mammal department. Non-native plants and pesticides can also poison animals, and it's less common in this area, but lead from things like fishing weights or lead shot is really important for fish eaters and carrion eaters. So I'm sure you guys, being with poison-free Agura, know all about mange. This was a case from a few years ago. This was a little coyote pup with mange. So everywhere that is not tan is diseased skin. So this little guy was emaciated, had a really bad case of mange, but overall was in pretty good health. And when we can treat both issues at once, so treat both the mange and the underlying issue that made that animal vulnerable to mange, whether that's rodenticide poisoning or some disease like leptospirosis, something similar, then we can actually have a really good chance of turning things around. But you do have to treat both. If you treat only the mange, you are not treating what made that animal vulnerable to it. And if you treat only the underlying issue, that mite is going to persist. But when you treat both, you can get really great results. This was that animal not that long later. This is not him at his most luxurious, but you can see how even just a few weeks later, that animal is immediately more comfortable, has more hair, is able to keep himself warm or cold. We get infectious disease that comes from a whole bunch of different sources. Sometimes it's passing from wildlife into domestic animals. Sometimes it's passing from domestic animals into wildlife. What I do like to highlight here is that unfortunately, a lot of the diseases that are persistent in the wildlife in our area originally came to us through the agricultural or pet trade and made their way into wildlife. So that is part of why in a lot of our photos with certain species, you will see people dressed up like the person in the back of this photo. So that is our volunteer Tracy in the back there. And you can see that she has a face mask, a face shield, a gown. She has nitrile gloves, like latex gloves under those big gloves she's wearing. And those big gloves are made of Kevlar, so that if this little one were to bite her, it would have no chance of getting through. And it's really important to us that when these animals arrive and are either on quarantine or are potentially still not tested or examined for certain diseases, that we are protecting ourselves and protecting the next patient we go to after the patient we're working with there. So you can see, even though our vet was only taking a quick feel here, even he made sure that he had a mask, had gloves, even though we didn't think this coyote pup had anything. We just want to be really cautious. And that's one of the important services that we can provide, is that we know how to keep ourselves and our next patient safe. And so we don't want people taking these animals home, trying to care for them in their homes. We want them to come to us, where if there is an issue, we can handle that issue safely and professionally. And it's rare, but we do get cruelty and poaching. So that would be things like seizure and surrender. There are cases where Fish and Wildlife will bring us animals that have been seized from someone who is keeping them illegally, or where someone will try to raise a wild animal and then realize that, oh, this animal needs more than they can provide, or oh, this animal needs foster siblings, and they'll bring it to us months later. The earlier we can get that animal into our care, the better the chances are we can rewild them and get them back into the wild. But we do have a pretty darn good track record, all things considered. We are very, very good at getting animals back out. There's also things like fisherman conflict. So not unfortunately uncommon one is pouch slashings of pelicans. Fishermen will get really frustrated with the pelicans that try to steal their bait, and will actually just take a knife and slash their pouch. that animal can then no longer eat, it all just falls through. So we work with organizations like International Bird Rescue in San Pedro, where if we collect those animals, we can stabilize them, get them started in care, and then we can get them to a specialized facility that is really, really good at fixing them up. And then there's also domestic animal conflict. So things like people shooting hawks because they are pigeon keepers, people, potentially shooting something like a coyote or a bobcat because they have livestock or pets they're worried about. It does happen, as unfortunate as it is. This was an odd case. I won't go too deep into it, but these are essentially not hawks that are native to our area. They're called Harris's hawks. And yet we were brought two of them from the same rough area, neither of which was banded the way a falconer's bird should have been. So we had a suspicion that someone had actually kept both of these birds illegally, and they had either escaped or been released. And needless to say, they were not in good condition. They didn't know how to survive in the wild here, and so they ended up with us. What I like to underline really is just that we don't always actually know the root cause of what brought our animals to us. So even though an animal might have a particular injury or they might come in thin with parasites, we don't know what drove them into a situation where they received that injury or what drove them out of their original habitat. So things like mortality events, we have one going on right now in brown pelicans that you'll see a lot of posts about from us and our partner organizations, where we are receiving starving brown pelicans. Um, Changes in migration. So when it's a drought year, you might see that a lot more seabirds will or water birds will flock to a particular area because their other sort of water sources where they might go over the winter have dried up. That can cause larger disease outbreaks. And so it can be really, really hard. If you have a fire in an area, chances are you as a rehab organization are not going to deal with a ton of burn victims. But what you might deal with, as we did the fall after the Woolsey fire, was a whole flush of first year hawks who couldn't find new territory. Could we directly link that to the Woolsey fire? No, we have no evidence. We can't ask all of those hawks, why couldn't you find territory? Where did you try? But you do have that sense of like, wow, isn't that interesting that we've never had a winter like that with all of these young red tails who just are coming in starving for no reason. We didn't have it before, we haven't had it since. It's associated with the Woolsey fire, but we have no way to prove that that's why they ended up with us. And so we know that for a lot of our patients, the reason they face the challenges that they face is because of habitat loss and fragmentation due to how closely they live with humans. So what do you do? When you find wildlife, we ask that you think about these things because whether an animal needs help and whether you can provide it are pretty complicated. So are they injured? Obviously. We don't want you to have to think that you are a vet and try to know every little thing. Just, is it obvious? Is there blood? Are they limping? Is one wing way down? Are they sick? Are they obviously not taking care of themselves? Do they have a big lump on one side of their head? Are they walking in circles in your backyard? Are they too young to be alone? Like, are they not just out of a tree, but actually laying on the ground, looking really sleepy, following humans or pets, or standing in the yard just crying over and over? That doesn't always mean that they're too young to be alone or that there's not a parent attending, but it's a good place to start. And then another is just, are they out of place? One of the important things I learned from small animal medicine was the term ADR, means ain't doing right. And if you feel like an animal ain't doing right, we want you to call so we can help you determine if they're okay. I mean, for things like beached water birds, raptors sitting on the ground for a long time, and other animals basically out exposed for a long period of time where you've walked by them once or twice and gone, I think you should have moved on by now. That's when we want you to call, not 2 days later. And ask yourself, is this normal? Remember that when a rehabber tells you that that animal doesn't need help, it's probably because of one of these kinds of things. So something like age can affect whether an animal needs help. Finding an adult sitting on the ground, not flying away, is going to be very different from finding a fledgling sitting on the ground, not running away. Their species, how they hunt, forage, groom, and socialize can look very, very different, even with birds that seem like they should be the same. time of year, breeding, migration, and food availability can really change how these animals act and where you're seeing them. We had got a lot of calls about deer in weird places after the Woolsey fire, for instance, and those deer didn't need help. They just were having to make different choices in where they were and how they lived because of their lack of habitat. And then context can change everything. The weather makes a big difference. Predators or prey being nearby makes a big difference. You know, a common one that we'll get is, oh, there's this hawk landed on my balcony an hour ago and he hasn't moved. Well, is there a whole thing of crows outside that's just waiting to mob him as soon as he leaves and he's using your patio as a shelter? Or alternatively, is he sitting on your lawn standing on prey and he's not leaving because he's waiting for you to back off? Anthropogenic attractants. So that would be anything human caused that brings them in. So that might be pet food, that might be a fruit tree. And then threats to the den or nest. A common one that we get calls about is escorting behavior from predators, particularly coyotes. These are basically situations where humans have unknowingly come close to a den and may not realize that. And this coyote is acting very forward, very direct, maybe trying to press you back. What they'll often do is actually follow you or even vocalize. It can be very alarming for people because coyotes are normally very fearful. And then suddenly you have this one who's looking directly at you. And what they're trying to communicate is, I need you to take 10 steps back and I'm going to follow you until you're far enough. And so we can help people talk through what these behaviors are. Are they really in distress? What's happening here? And then from there, the question is, what kind of help do they need? Coming into human care is really, really stressful. We are a predator to almost every single one of these animals. They consider us to be a potential deadly threat. And so bringing them into our care is a last resort. If they can be helped in the wild, we would rather do that. And that's things like renesting or reuniting fallen squirrels or different little birds that just need to go back into the nest. Providing a safe exit for something like a mom and her ducklings that if you open the gate, she might just walk them out of your yard. Just leaving a place to rest for a bird that maybe has gotten exhausted by an unusual storm event or something similar. So you might have to bring your pets in, might have to move that animal to a safer location, but they might just need a chance to calm down and get their wits back. Um, and in the end, they might need admission to a rehabilitator. And there are resources for people who can help handle or transport the animal if you're not comfortable doing that. But we can also potentially offer you ways to do it and get that animal into care more directly that are more safe and comfortable. So things like if you have a hawk and you're not comfortable grabbing a hawk, we can tell you how to get that animal into a box without holding them. So the bottom line that we want you to know is that we're here for you. You know, you don't have to know what to do next. We are happy to talk you through it. Leave us a message. We will call you back. We get a lot of that where it's we didn't pick up. Everybody who's answering our phones for the most part has another job. And so what we usually do is we go through our messages, we call everyone back, we get a photo or video by text so we can assess the situation, and then we give you the best resource, whether that's something to do on site, whether that's our location, or whether that's another organization that takes an animal that we don't. So feel free to screenshot, take a photo, write this down, whatever you want. You know, we are here for you guys.